is Joseph Patridge. I'm the director of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation by Dr. Adam Bodnar, the Polish Commissioner for Human Rights. Before I introduce Dr. Bodnar, I would like to formally acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on territory delineated by Treaty 6 of 1876. This is an area where First Nations and Métis people have lived and interacted for many years, and they continue to enrich and diversify the environment here in Edmonton. I'd also like to mention that today's webinar will be first a presentation by Dr. Bodnar, followed by a question and answer period. The question and answer period you can participate in by the Q&A question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. You will write in questions and Dr. Bodnar and I will answer them, or I will pass them on to Dr. Bodnar to answer. So that technical issue being addressed, now let me say something about our speaker. Dr. Bodnar is the current Polish Commissioner for Human Rights. He teaches at the nonprofit university SWPS, University of Social Sciences and Humanities. He has an undergraduate degree in law from the University of Warsaw, as well as a PhD from the same university. He went on to study at the CEU, Central European University in Budapest, where he earned a degree in comparative constitutional law. Dr. Bodnar has had a long career already in the field of human rights. He has worked at a number of different organizations. He was a member of the Helsinki Human Rights Foundation. He was an expert advisor to the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights and a director of the UN Fund for Victims of Torture. Dr. Bodnar has received the Rafto Prize for Human Rights Defenders in 2018, and we met him at the Wirth Institute at the University of Alberta a few months ago when he was the 2020 visiting lecturer in human rights. At that time, he talked about the role of the judiciary and some of the challenges to an independent judiciary in contemporary Poland. Unfortunately, he arrived right at the same time as the coronavirus did, and we were not able to have Dr. Bodnar come by to one of our Central European cafes to talk about contemporary Poland and issues relating to women's rights then. So Dr. Bodnar was nice enough to accept our invitation to come back virtually across the ocean to snowy Edmonton this time to discuss the fallout after the Constitutional Court of Poland on 22nd of October of this year passed or issued a legal statement which has had serious consequences, which I'll leave Dr. Bodnar to discuss. So with that bit of background, please welcome our distinguished visitor, the Commissioner for Human Rights of Poland, Dr. Adam Bodnar. Dr. Bodnar, the floor is yours.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to say that how much I miss Edmonton. It was really great time for me to be with you just before the outbreak of the coronavirus, both in Canada and Poland. I remember that I was coming with one of the last flights flying over the Atlantic at that time. And so I'm very grateful for your hospitality at that moment and that I could contribute to different debates that were taking place. And as you see, me and my wife were missing hockey match. Unfortunately, we couldn't attend the Oilers match at that time, but I hope that one day I will be able to do it. So let me just say a few words about what I'm going to present. Poland is right now in a very interesting moment of our history and protection of rights, because although it is the middle of November, we are just after issuance of a very serious judgment by the Polish Constitutional Court, and also after a series of demonstrations that were taking place in Warsaw, but also in other cities. And those demonstrations had a huge impact on the public debate. And to be honest, we don't even know what would be the political consequence of this and how to resolve the dramatic conflict that is in the Polish society. And when I remember our discussion about this European cafe that was going to take place at Wirth Institute, I think that at that time, I wouldn't have that much to say as I have now. So maybe from the point of view, from the intellectual point of view, I think this situation brings, I would say, like more dramatism into the whole story. I have a presentation, so let me open my folder with the presentation. I hope it will work. Okay, it seems it works. Okay. 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 My presentation is about recent protests and consequences concerning women's rights protection after the judgment of the Constitutional Court of 22nd October 2020. And maybe you may just think, you know, what is the point of just naming this presentation like this? Annushka has just spilled the oil. Here on this slide, you see one of the pictures that have been made just during demonstrations. On the left side, you see that somebody is carrying a poster saying Annushka has just spilled the oil. And it is basically the reference to the quotation from Mikhail Bulgakov, Master and Margaret. This quotation stated, this sentence stated, Annushka has already bought the sunflower oil and has not only bought it, but has already spilled it. And also there is a song recently recorded by one of the most well-known Polish young artists, Krzysztof Zalewski, who, I quote, is singing more or less like this: if anything happens just today, something will fall down on the head. You cannot escape because Annushka has just spilled the oil. And suddenly it is the reference to something what we could describe, looking into the Master and Margaret, as a consequence of events, that although we don't know what may happen in future, we shouldn't ignore it, we shouldn't disregard it, because there is a certain course of events written down somewhere in the in our destiny. So this sentence about Annushka refers to words that were made by Voland to Berlioz, who kind of warned Berlioz about the consequence of what may happen in future. And later on, there is, because of this oil, the tram gets out of the railroad and cuts the head of Berlioz. So if Berlioz would take seriously words of Voland, then maybe this consequence would not be met by him. And interestingly, people that demonstrated in Warsaw, in other cities, they already feel that something is in the air, that something will happen, that something unexpected will be present in the context of a demonstration. But before getting there, let me briefly outline the past. So how the protection of women's rights looked before the judgment of the Constitutional Court. First of all, Poland has a pretty decent anchor in terms of the Constitution and European Union law, as well as ratification of different international human rights treaties protecting women and equality between men and women, and non-discrimination, as well as non-discrimination principle. So I think importantly, Poland is a party to the European Convention on Human Rights, Regional Human Rights Treaty, to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and to the Istanbul Convention on Prevention and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. But what happens is that although there are all those different legal instruments ratified or adopted, sometimes the reality is much different because of the pressure from the Catholic Church and its allies, because of the creation of the notion of so-called gender ideology, via which the Catholic Church describes all different changes in the society that threaten traditional role of the family and traditional division of labor within a family, and all different things that come, in the opinion of the Church, as a consequence of this Western civilization. So in Poland, we have some problems with gender mainstreaming. We have problems with real guarantees of women's rights. And we see that it is the issue which has created and still creates a lot of polarization in the public discourse. I think that looking back, the very important anchoring mechanism was membership of Poland in the European Union, because Poland had to implement EU anti-discrimination directives. Poland had to amend the labor code before accession of Poland to the European Union, and to include provision that you cannot be discriminated due to your sex. But interestingly, Poland was quite reluctant in passing some additional laws. So, for example, laws on equality body were passed only as late as in 2010, so 6 years after joining the European Union. And the major reason was because Poland was approaching so-called presidency in the European Union, and it was a shame that we do not have a comprehensive legislation in this regard. But interestingly, we don't have still a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation in Poland, and Polish law on non-discrimination is similar to Swiss cheese. We have some, I would name it, irrational loopholes, and some that are sometimes contrary to constitutional axiology. But interestingly, in addition to all of this, there were some interesting successes of lobbying by women's groups and by disability persons groups. For example, some time ago, we have introduced gender quotas in elections, and also the Istanbul Convention on Domestic Violence has been ratified. In 2015, after winning of elections by Law and Justice Party, standards have been decreased. So we don't see the same progress in terms of protection of rights as before. Quite otherwise, those standards are becoming lower and lower every day. And the judgment of the Constitutional Court of 22nd October 2020 is about access to legal abortion. So I think that in order to understand the consequence of this judgment, we should spend a few minutes on explaining what is the law in this regard. So the Polish law has been framed in 1993 in a law, in the legislative act named the Law on Family Planning and Conditions for Termination of Pregnancy. And under this law, in general, access to legal abortion is allowed when pregnancy is a result of rape, fetus has a genital disease, and the third condition, when pregnancy constitutes a threat to women's health or life. And this legal regulation is binding since 1993, as I said, and it is called commonly a so-called abortion compromise. If you mention the word compromise to any feminist in Poland, you could risk your really health or life, because no feminist would agree with this word. Feminists claim that it is no compromise, it is just taking advantage by the Catholic Church of the strong position in the society, and finding some kind of a solution, but this solution cannot be accepted by anybody who is in fact pro-choice. On the other hand, if you ask anybody who is affiliated with the Catholic Church or who is, let's say, right-winger, they would say, in our opinion, the law should be even stronger. Maybe we should even go towards total ban on abortion. Interestingly, there was one moment in the Polish public life when the access to abortion has been increased or has been extended. It was 1996 when the parliament, dominated by the left-wing party, has adopted a provision allowing for access to abortion due to so-called social reasons. But in the judgment of 28th May 1997, the Constitutional Court has declared that that kind of social reasons abortion is unconstitutional. Interestingly, the Constitutional Court declared that the protection of life from the conception is a consequence of the principle that Poland is a democratic state ruled by law. So it was quite, I would say, extravagant interpretation of the of the constitution at that time. But basically, as a result of this, it was possible to cut this possibility of making abortion due to social reasons, and basically to come back to this compromise, which I do to the so-called compromise, to those three conditions when abortion is allowed. But interestingly, even if this compromise existed or was binding, it was not really effectively performed. So can you imagine that every year only around 800, 900, 1,000, 1,100 legal abortions per year are made? So in a country which is 38 million people, I think it's not, it is not the statistics that shows the real significance of a problem. And why is it so? Because medical doctors are abusing so-called conscience clause. So by referring to their conscience, they may refer to make any termination of pregnancy. Moreover, if medical doctor is refusing to make an abortion, there are certain difficulties in obtaining abortion from other medical doctors, and there was a judgment of the Constitutional Court of 2015 on this. And it happens that if there is an institution like a hospital, which is, for example, named after, let's say, John Paul II, it happens that the precondition to obtain a possibility to using the name of the Pope is adoption of so-called conscience clause by the whole medical institution. So it means that in this institution, no abortion might be performed at all. Altogether, in consequence, we have just 1,000 abortions, legal abortions per year. So it means that Polish women who would like to have an abortion, not only under the law, but also because of so-called social reasons, they use services of so-called abortion underground, which is of course illegal on the part of medical doctors, so they risk losing their license, or they perform so-called abortion tourism. So in neighboring countries like Slovakia, Czech Republic, Germany, it is quite easy to obtain that abortion. But it is interesting that that kind of a solution creates, in fact, inequality in a society, because if you are coming from a small city, from rural Poland, it is quite difficult to obtain any service. You don't have money basically to go and to make a service, to make a termination of pregnancy somewhere abroad. Here is a publication of one of the leading organizations dealing with access to abortion. One of the leading pro-choice organizations, Federation for Women's Rights and Family Planning. So this organization claims that this continuation of a practice that on the one hand we have the law, but this law is not practiced, and then conditions for making legal abortion are quite limited, it creates so-called hell of women. It is this notion, hell of women, is a reference to a very famous book that has been published by Polish writer Tadeusz Boy-Żeleński before the Second World War. Here is you see a cover of their publication from 2007. Interestingly, this issue of access to abortion has been subject of attention of international organizations, and especially of the European Court of Human Rights. So there were a couple of cases concerning access to legal abortion. The most important one, I think, was the first one, Alicja Tysiąc against Poland. In this case, women sought possibility to make a termination of pregnancy because she was afraid that she may lose her eyesight. She was having -8 dioptria eyesight deficit, and she was afraid that because of the pressure in the blood, she may lose totally her possibility. She may become blind. And basically she was not able to obtain an abortion within a proper time. In our case against Poland, the refusal of abortion was basically medical doctors didn't want to make prenatal testing in a proper time, and woman had to deliver the child with terminal disease. P&S against Poland, the pregnancy was a result of illegal act, and it was also impossible to get an abortion in proper time. And there is also one case which is now pending. It is the case about the fetus with genetic disease, refusal to perform an abortion due to the conscience clause by the medical doctor, and lack of possibility of effective referral to some other medical doctor that would perform an abortion. So we have 3 judgments. One case is pending. We wait for the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. But it is important to underline what is the approach of the ECHR to those cases. So first of all, the court is saying it is not our role to assess the Polish legislation, but they claim that they may evaluate whether access to legal abortion is guaranteed, whether rights are practical and not just theoretical and illusory. And usually, European Court of Human Rights finds a violation of Article 3 and Article 8, right to respect of private life and prohibition of degrading and inhuman treatment. But so that is the perspective of the European Court of Human Rights. So basically the court with judgment is saying that although you have rights, you cannot enjoy them because they are not effective, they are not practical, but they are sometimes just illusory. But I would like to say that in last years, we had some other problems with women's rights. So the pressure by the current right-wing government resulted in some changes concerning in vitro fertilization. So for example, between 2013 and 2016, there were 21,666 children born as a result of public funding of in vitro. But because the new government, the government by Law and Justice, cut funding, right now it is impossible to get public funding except if you live in a certain local community. So for example, Warsaw City is sponsoring IVF therapy for a limited number of families. Second, we had some problems with protection of women against domestic violence. So just this summer, there was an intensive discussion whether Poland should withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. And also there are some cities in Poland that still do not have any programs on prevention of domestic violence. And the good example is Zakopane, city in southern Poland, famous for a very traditional community. But interestingly, because it is kind of a paradox that in this year we had also a situation when somehow government has adopted a law that creates more protection for victims of violence. So sometimes you see some kind of paradoxes that on the one hand, on the political level, government is saying some things, and sometimes it is able to adopt some legislation that corrects or repairs the situation of victims, like the law on the isolation of a perpetrator from a victim. But there are also other points of concern. So for example, since 2016, so it is one more reform by the new government, the day after pill is available only upon prescription and not over the counter. There were also discussions, fortunately not yet finished, about introduction of so-called conscience clause for pharmacists. There were no legislative developments concerning some biological issues. So this kind of a ideological shadow behind all different discussions leads to a situation when we do not have a proper bioethical rules in different areas of lives. There is also a very limited funding to independent NGOs dealing with violence against women. We can experience also hate speech against feminists. We have huge significant problems with proper sexual education in schools. And finally, as a part of the more general pattern, we see a lot of pressure and repressive practices towards LGBT persons, including hate speech. I mention this because, in my opinion, all those other points of concern and other issues concerning women's rights, they are interconnected because they are a consequence of a very strong presence of the Catholic Church and organizations supporting Catholic Church in the Polish public life. So, but very important point in recent history was 2016, October 2016, when we had so-called Black protest. At that time, there was a so-called citizens draft law submitted to the parliament that aimed towards introducing total prohibition of abortion, so total ban on abortion. And women, as you see, organized themselves, and they organized so-called umbrella protests. Here you see a screen from Warsaw, and similar protests were organized in more than 150 Polish cities. And this protest resulted in emergence of new women's rights movements, such as Ogólnopolski Strajk Kobiet, so I would translate it, All Poland Women's Strike, or Girls for Girls, which is Dziewuchy Dziewuchom. And interestingly, this protest was so powerful that Law and Justice Party, the ruling party, became quite scared. So they didn't push forward any changes concerning access to abortion. They just started to adopt all those small kind of policies like day after pill, IVF restrictions, just to, in a way, to pay a concession to some radicals, to Catholic Church organizations. And also in October 2016, Marta Lempart became a new leader of the women's movement. And this protest of 2016 was totally regarded as a huge success because government at that time decided not to go further on with this, with all those ideas of making anything with this so-called abortion compromise. Okay, but what was the political dynamics after this Black protest? So first of all, we shouldn't forget that Law and Justice Party was implementing its road towards, I would name it, competitive authoritarianism. So it was transforming different state institutions into some kind of a authoritarian system. But at the same time, Law and Justice has a policy of non-interference into private life of citizens because of the risk of possible engagement of young citizens. So Law and Justice was very much afraid that if we touch upon the issue of abortion, then we'll have protest of young people, and simply we should rather keep this sphere of life for we should be concerned not to engage too much people and not to empower too much people into the domestic discourse. As I said, there were some small changes concerning different sensitive areas, and it was a way of political concession towards radical groups or the Catholic Church. But there was also at the same time growing pressure by the Catholic Church on the need to change the abortion law. And some NGOs created a coalition, and the major organization in this coalition was Ordo Juris, which is the organization of lawyers who are very much dedicated to pro-life, homophobic, anti-LGBT positions. Ordo Juris became quite influential in the Polish political life, and they have also managed to change a discourse on abortion. So for example, the new notion has been created, eugenic abortion. So by this notion, they started to claim that this condition of that you should have a possibility to terminate a pregnancy due to the genetic disease of the fetus, it is a way of controlling the population, a way of eliminating like children with Down syndrome or with other genetic diseases, and that we should not allow for that kind of approach in Poland because of the need to protect, because of the constitutional need to protect life. And last year we had presidential elections. We had also parliamentary elections, and it seems that 2019 were parliamentary elections. Here is a mistake in this, obviously, but after those parliamentary elections, there was something like a need to pay off debts to the Catholic Church, and also what happened is the competition between different camps at the right side of the political scene. So Law and Justice was not the only significant player on the right wing of the political scene, but also there were other players. A new party has appeared on the scene, and also Law and Justice started to have some competition with the satellite parties with whom Law and Justice is building like a bigger coalition. So here you see a room of the Constitutional Court, the hearing room of the Constitutional Court. Photo quite symbolic to me because it was the last time I was present in the Constitutional Court. It was 13th December 2016. At that time, Constitutional Court was still independent institution. Starting from 2017, we claimed that this institution is not any longer independent. It is heavily subordinated to the policies of the government. So the Constitutional Court is headed by Julia Przyłębska. Mrs. Przyłębska is not even hiding her sympathy towards leader of the party, Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński. And some time ago, a group of parliamentary deputies has brought an abstract motion to the Constitutional Court, claiming that this condition allowing for abortion, which is the genetic disease of the fetus, is unconstitutional and that it should be eliminated from the Polish law. This petition has been supported by Ordo Iuris, by other pro-life NGOs, but also by Ombudsman for Children, who more or less is coming from similar political camp. On 22nd October 2020, the Constitutional Court has declared that genetic disease of a fetus cannot be a ground for abortion. It is important to note that in Poland, 90 or 95% even of abortions are made due to this reason. The judgment has become quite controversial because it was obvious, I would say to everybody, that the verdict has not been dictated by judges themselves, but it was dictated by the ruling party. That the ruling party somehow at this moment of history thought that it is important to turn public attention into this discussion, most probably in order to cover up some crisis in the operation of the government as a result of the fight with pandemic. Please note that we are in the middle of a storm regarding pandemic, and the government, I would say, over vacation has lost a lot of, over the summer has lost a lot of time of not preparing the country for so-called second wave of the coronavirus. So interestingly, in this judgment, there were 3 judges who are by the legal community not regarded as typical regular judges of the Constitutional Court. It is a long story, but I would like to say that you can question this judgment from the point of view of its validity, and number of scholars are putting this question regarding this judgment. Interestingly, there were 2 dissenting opinions, and so those judges said that basically regulating on this is a matter for the parliament and not for the Constitutional Court. Second, they claim that you cannot push women into the heroic action, and delivering a child with a genetic disease, especially the child that may just die after after being born, is an act of heroism, and it is not the role of the state to compel women into that kind of acts of heroism. But most importantly, there was an eruption of protests after the judgment, just immediately after the judgment, and mostly those protests were directed against Jarosław Kaczyński and the ruling party, and a lot of people decided to march into streets despite the pandemic. So just a few words about those protests. Those protests were organized by All Poland Strike of Women, mentioned by me, Marta Lempart. Those protests took place in big cities, but also in smaller cities, including traditional strongholds like Podkarpacie Voivodeship. And when we calculate numbers, on 13th October, which was the peak of protests, there were more or less 500,000 people participating in protests when you count all cities together. There were not only demonstrations, but also road and traffic blocks and sit-ins. Police presented quite responsible behavior because at a certain point they realized that total number of police is 100,000, so they cannot even stop people in protesting because they are outnumbered by protesters. There was a huge, massive participation of a young generation, which was a new thing for Poland as compared to different other massive protests taking place in 2015 or 2017. There were some controversies concerning protests because protesters were using quite vulgar words. I think I shouldn't repeat them here to this audience. There were also some small protests in church, and those protests in church provoked Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński to to make something like incitement to nationalistic groups to protect churches. So all of this created kind of a strange situation when the ruling party is calling regular people, including some people who are commonly regarded as hooligans, as protectors of church and traditional values. And protests, as of now, are continued, but maybe in a smaller fashion because of the pandemic. But the women's strike has transformed itself, is creating some new platform for discussion, which is the consultative council that has been created. The women's strike has presented list of claims, and they claim inter alia unrestricted access to abortion up to 12 week of pregnancy, and also they claim that the government should resign, should be dismissed. So there are a number of those claims, but I would like just to turn your attention to this claim concerning access to abortion. So protesters are not claiming that they would like to come back to this so-called compromise. They would like to have a more or less the law as it is in a number of other countries where you can claim abortion due to so-called social reasons. So more or less, some people claim that if you started, the pendulum to wing, so if the pendulum is going into one direction, it may right now go into the other direction, into more liberal direction. So here you see a picture from by Bart Staszewski, a famous Polish activist, from a demonstration in the middle of Warsaw on the 30th October 2020. Here you see some eruption of young enthusiasm. Here you see one of the, let's say, slogans of those demonstrations. For those of you who know Polish, you can note that it's not a very nice word, but this word denotes kind of a general perception of the Polish government by protesters. And just a few words about perspective. So, because right now, as I said, we are in this moment when we do not know yet what may happen. So first of all, we should think about consequences of the Constitutional Court's judgment. The judgment, interestingly, has not been yet published. It is per se, in my opinion, violation of the Constitution, but it seems to me that it is the solution that has been made by the government in order not to fire protests once again. So as long as the judgment is not published, this condition of termination of pregnancy of the genetic disease of a fetus is still binding. So women may still get a termination of pregnancy on the basis of this provision. Second, President of the Republic has come into the play, and the President has decided to present a draft law. But under this draft law, you will be able to terminate a pregnancy only if this genetic disease of a fetus is such that it will result in the death of the child. So this condition will be the so-called lethal genetic disease. The question is there any room of compromise? In the public discussion, I was presenting the position that maybe we should refer to the example of the Irish Citizens' Assembly that was discussing the issue of access to abortion. And most probably, if this judgment enters into force, there is a risk that not only women will be restricted in their rights, but also there will be a litigation of that kind of cases before international bodies, such as United Nations Human Rights Committee or the European Court of Human Rights. The second point is, what would be the role of the Catholic Church in future Poland? In my opinion, all those changes that happened over last years could be named as something like changes being the result of the stench of incense. So incense is this special herb that is used in the Catholic Church in order to make some ceremonies, some masses more kind of influential. But it seems to me that Catholic Church was really putting a lot of pressure on those illiberal changes in Poland. But interestingly, it seems to me that for a number of people who participated in those demonstrations, the reason for them was not only abortion, but also the lack of responsibility of the Catholic Church priests and bishops for pedophilia. We still have we still have to settle accounts with the church concerning this. And also because of the fact that church is sponsored with quite significant funds by the states. And the third point is regarding perspective. So whether these were just women's rights protests, or maybe it was just, it was more generally protest against the government and lack of satisfaction with how this government performs, not only in the context of pandemic, but also in the context of these threats to judicial independence or lack of proper cooperation with the European Union. But even if this protest is against the government, we should remember that next parliamentary elections are due to happen in 2023. So just to conclude, Annushka has spilled the oil. I claim that political and social reality is completely different than it was before 22nd October 2020, and we can observe a series of unexpected events as a follow-up of the judgment. The issuance of this judgment in October 2020 is regarded commonly as a political mistake of the ruling party. It seems also that massive groups of society started to understand that authoritarian trends, so here issuance of the judgment by the subordinated constitutional court, may influence their private lives, that politics is not just some abstract discussion, but this politics might affect their private lives. It seems also that in case there is at certain point a political turning moment, there will be a need to address seriously equality policies in Poland and to limit undue influence of the Catholic Church on politics. And finally, I would claim that for young citizens, protests may become part of their kind of a cultural revolution, and some methods of protest were even similar to Orange Alternative of 80s. Orange Alternative was a series of protests that were referring to some absurdity, nonsensical humor, or that were suggesting that that it is the way how to fight with the communist power by bringing things into more kind of an absurd type of humor and methods of protest. So you could see a lot of parts of that kind of behavior during demonstrations. So here, for example, one of the photos by a very famous photographer, Chris Nidenthal. So this card, which is this poster, it says, "Due to these green eyes, I have pissed off." And it is quite interesting because she's referring to a very famous disco polo song by an artist who is heavily supported by, and vice versa, by the ruling camp. And here you can see a group of young people who are fighting for freedom. They think it will be their freedom in this new Poland if their slogans, if their claims will be fulfilled, and there will be a political turning point. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that we will have a wonderful discussion concerning this topic and connected issues with this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bodnar, for this overview, and also look into the future a bit, right? What might be coming down the pike. So as I said at the outset, the way we'll structure the question and answer is that I'll ask you to write your questions in the question and answer, and then I will read them to our guest. And I'll start with one that says, has Poland's Soviet legacy affected its treatment of women, either in terms of constitutional protections or its attacks on human rights? So a question about the Soviet legacy and that the consequences.
Very interesting question. I think there are like two points we should make here. Please note that in Soviet times, women were heavily promoted in terms of their participation in professional life. So there was even such a slogan by Communist Party, "Women on tractors," so that women should also participate in should be professional farmers and should also, use this agricultural equipment. But there were a lot of women that had a higher education, that could develop professionally, that could make, that could have important functions in a society. And for sure, maybe it was also because of the fact that in order for a regular family to have a decent life, two members of the family had to work in the communist Poland, and it was rather rare that women were not work. It was possible, but a Communist Party was promoting employment of all the people in the society. So we didn't have, let's say, this kind of a German, which is commonly named as KKK, which is Kinder, Kuchen, Kirche. Yeah? So it was not a Polish tradition. And taking this into account, when we are talking these days about gender mainstreaming or about equality of men and women at the workplace, I think this discussion is easier, although we still have problems, of course. So for example, if you look into the management boards or supervisory boards of stock exchange companies, of course you will have majority of men. I really like the example with judiciary, because in judiciary, at the level of district court, you have a majority of women. Then if you go to regional courts, then you have more or less equality. Then if you go to appeal court, suddenly majority of men. And in the Supreme Court, you have like 75% of men. Okay, so like a typical pyramid where men are getting higher and women do not have the same possibility. But coming back to the second point I would like to mention is that, of course, it is the question of abortion. So in communist times, of course, abortion was just possible. It was not a problem to make an abortion. But please note that it was the Catholic Church that helped the solidarity movement to pave the way to free Poland. So the John Paul II as the Pope, but also number of bishops, number of priests were giving support to solidarity leaders, and they were giving shelter and support in terms of distribution of materials, opposition underground materials, but also all those masses that were organized during communist times were very much symbolic in terms of, that solidarity movement could count each other, could count whether it is massive enough to protest against Communist Party. So what does it mean? It means that after '89, Catholic Church wanted to take advantage of this. So, okay, so we contributed to the freedom, so now we would like to have our share in ruling the Poland, in construing the Poland. So that is why we had this compromise of 1993. That is why the teaching of religion has been introduced into the public schools. That is why Catholic Church was the only institution that took full advantage of so-called reprivatization, and number of other benefits that were taken during this time. So maybe, and from this point of view, those protests are quite symbolic because they are also important from the point of view of Catholic Church losing importance in the political life. So if there will be a turning point, I'm pretty certain that those protests will influence the future position of the Catholic Church. Thank you.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting issue that I was thinking about, and you mentioned the role the Catholic Church played in the anti-communist period. That's decades ago now, right? So the role of generations, I think, has to be taken into account. You showed pictures of a lot of younger people. These are people who don't remember the role the Catholic Church played in 1980s. This is a whole nother world, right? So do you think that plays out why there's so many younger people involved? They don't see the role that the Roman Catholic Church played as such a positive one because they don't remember the situation back in communist era.
Yeah. You are exactly right. That is the point, but I will just give one more example. When we had those institutional reforms in 2015, 2016, and 17, when when the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court has been attacked by the ruling party, there were a lot of demonstrations. They were also massive. But interestingly, they were attended by people in the age of 40 and more, and especially by the people in the age of 50, 60. So mostly people who were remembering old times and who knew that destruction of institutional guarantees may bring us back to the communist system, where you do not have a protection of the rule of law. But for the young generation, those protests were completely not understandable. You know, they didn't get a clue what is going on with this Constitutional Court and with this Supreme Court. Maybe there was one moment in 2017 when the young generation started to feel that, okay, maybe all those protests, those changes may lead towards the exiting of Poland from the European Union, just like United Kingdom has did it. And for the young generation, this membership in the EU is something important because it is part of their identity. But not, you know, the fact that, you know, there will be some, you know, kind of a judge or prosecutor that will punish you for some, you know, illegal activities or for your dissident activity. They didn't get it. So that is why those protests are important, because they constitute a connection of two issues. One, this judgment has impact on your life, because maybe, you know, you or your girlfriend will be in a situation that you have to make a decision about the future of the pregnancy, and in this country you will not be able to make a proper decision. Second, they have understood that it is not the decision of the Constitutional Court, of some independent body, but it is just a purely political decision made by Kaczynski without with bypassing of the whole parliamentary procedure. So I think it is a generational shift here and generational impact of this discussion.
Let me go back to the question and answers here. Or the questions, I guess. You're the guy with the answers. Does the scale of the protests signify a real polarization, such as we see in the USA, say a 50-50 split in public opinion? Or are the protests the tip of an iceberg that is anti-PIS throughout all of society? So yeah, these protests, what are they, how do you read them? What do you think they mean? How significant are they?
I think the power of those protests is because they are not just about opponents of the Law and Justice Party. For sure, you know, you have people there who are entrepreneurs that have lost their profits due to pandemic and some organizational mistakes by the government. You have people who are fighting for women's rights. You have LGBT groups. You know, we have a really huge problem with attacking LGBT persons by the ruling party politicians. But you have a lot of regular members of the society who are not belonging to any of those typical protesting groups. And interestingly, if you look into polls, more or less 67, 68% of the Polish population claims that it was wrong to touch upon this so-called abortion compromise. So including traditional supporters of the law and justice. So they claimed that, you know, sorry, it was a certain solution, maybe not satisfactory to everybody, but we shouldn't touch on this regulation. So I think that the major surprise to this government was that all those protests were taking place in southern and eastern Poland. So can you imagine that, you know, you have a city of, let's say, 50,000 inhabitants, which is traditionally right-wing, and suddenly you have 2,000 people marching on streets, especially young generation. So so that was completely unexpected, and that's why those protests cut through the typical lines of political division. So people were concerned with this with this judgment and the impact of the judgment on their life.
Let me see here. Well, this goes to your point about the next elections in 2023. What steps would the opposition need to take to bring independence back to the Supreme Court? I'm guessing the questioner actually means the Constitutional Court, or actually that's an interesting issue for us in general in North America. What's the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court? But this question is, what do you need to do to bring back independence? It kind of relates to your presentation here at the University of Alberta back in March, right, about the role of the independent judiciary in Poland.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, let me explain how the Polish system looks like. So we have three top courts. One is Constitutional Court, which is the organ designed more or less like in Austria, because it is based on the Austrian-German model. And it is the organ which is composed of 15 judges, selected for 9 years term. And the role of this organ is to review compliance of the legislation with constitution. And only this, so you review all different pieces of legislation, maybe some administrative regulations also from the point of view of compliance with the constitution. And we had a wonderful working constitutional court between 1989 and 2016 even, which was almost going into the direction of the same quality of the legal reasoning as the German Constitutional Court. The methods of selection of judges were pretty decent because they were serving for during 9 years period. You could, make different reconfiguration of judges, and basically their terms were very much independent from the current politics, and the composition of the court was quite diversified, taking into account different points of view of, let's say, ideological origins of judges. But the most important reform that has been made by Land Justice in 2015 and 2016 was to pack in the Constitutional Court with loyal judges. It's quite a complicated story. There were big opinions. There is one wonderful book on this by Professor Wojciech Sadurski, Poland's Constitutional Breakdown. Book was published by Oxford University Press. So there, I can refer just to read it through, because there is a good explanation how this process took place. But the end result of this was packing in with loyal judges and creating a possibility of controlling the docket of cases and composition of judicial panels in all different cases. So what is important is that the person who is the president of the Constitutional Court is strongly loyal to the leader, Jarosław Kaczyński. So you cannot expect anything non-typical from the Constitutional Court to appear. All the judgments of political importance are subject of, I wouldn't say consultation because I don't know it, but you don't have any doubt that they are part of the political process. But we have also two other courts. One is Supreme Court, which is reviewing final judgments with some extraordinary appeals or cassation appeals. But the role of the Supreme Court is not to check compliance of the legislation with the Constitution, but just to check application of law in different individual cases. So let's say if you have somebody who is penalized for, I don't know, defamation of a politician, then you will go up with this case up to the Supreme Court. Or if you have a case concerning insulting of religious freedoms, then it will be the Supreme Court reviewing this. Or if you have a case concerning civil damages and you will end up with this case in the appeal courts, then you will be able to go to the Supreme Court. So it is the individual review of cases. And then we have the Supreme Administrative Court, which is the court controlling legality of administrative decisions. So you may challenge, for example, final decision of tax authorities and to go to the first regional administrative court, then Supreme Administrative Court. Or you can, I don't know, if you are somebody who is seeking refugee status, you are refused, you can go to administrative courts. So what happened is that, as I said, Constitutional Court is already subject of control. Supreme Court and Supreme Administrative Court, not yet. So there is a certain attempt to pack in those courts with judges, but this attempt has not been yet finalized fully. So the question is whether in upcoming years it will be possible for the government, in fact for the special organ, which is the National Council of Judiciary, and for the President of the Republic, to pack in those two courts with some new judges in order to dilute the remaining independent judges. There is and it is one of the points of conflict of Poland with the European Union. So European Union is trying to do a lot in order to stop this process to happen, and also to unwrap some of the changes that happened, especially in the Supreme Court, but Polish government is not very much willing to do it. I don't know, to be honest, what may happen in 2023, but it seems to me that it will be much easier to repair the situation in the Supreme Court and Supreme Administrative Court than with the situation in the Constitutional Court. Because with the Constitutional Court, in order to do it, you would have to change a constitution. So in order to repair this institution, you would have to change, in fact, the way this institution operates. For example, in order to, I don't know, shorten terms of existing judges of the Constitutional Court. But for this, you need to have 2/3 majority in the parliament, which is extremely difficult to achieve. So there is a risk that even if opposition wins some next elections, all different institutions that are subject of political control these days by the law and justice will be used as a weapon against the opposition in order to prevent changes to happen, or in order to freeze the situation, or to wait for another parliamentary election. So we'll see how it may look like, but it might be an extremely difficult process, because this destruction of different elements of constitutionalism is quite significant already. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how many of the people who are with us today were at the presentation yesterday from the Center for Austrian Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But if you were, you may recall that that was about the 100th anniversary of the Austrian Constitution, and the role of the legal scholar, the Austro-American legal scholar Hans Kelsen. And one of the things we just talked about yesterday, for those of you who were with us, was the importance of setting up this constitutional court in this very divisive period of 1920. They're celebrating in Austria 100 years constitution, and it comes out of this very divisive period of 1919, 1920, when they really needed some kind of a neutral arbiter. And now, if that constitutional court is no longer a neutral arbiter, the whole system is challenged. You mentioned before that this is the German-Austrian system that the Polish government, the Polish constitution follows. But the role of the constitutional court, as seen by Kelsen and others, was as this stabilizing force that if you break that, the whole system is in trouble, right? It's a constitutional problem that I think Kelsen and the others recognized the challenges at the time. So that's what we talked about yesterday. Today, I'll go back to the next question. What signs can we look for in the coming months and years to see whether there really is a cultural revolution among young people? Can you predict the future? Do you look in the future?
Yeah. You know, I would say that some commentators claim that it is a cultural revolution. I'm not sure. I'm not sure because, first of all, it's not my specialty to analyze. I'm not the psychologist or sociologist that would analyze people's behavior. But those people who claim that it is a cultural revolution indicate three things. First of all, they indicate that the participation in those protests is most probably is for many people the first time they ever take advantage, the first time they exercise personal rights and freedoms in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Second point is that if you look into the context and into the way how those assemblies were organized, they were extremely spontaneous, and they were based on a very they created kind of a sense of community among those young people in the way they have how they have been organized and how people spontaneously did different things. So, like, you know, I mentioned this Annushka has just spilled the oil, but you know, there is like a whole bunch of different other posters, slogans, you know, that have been made in a very innovative and non-typical way. The third point I would add is the level of maybe not hatred, but level of passion in expressing discontent regarding the government was extremely high. So use of vulgar words, really very strong vulgar words towards the government. I think it is something interesting. We didn't have it before. And here, you know, you could just imagine, you know, thousands of people who are just using very vulgar words, what the government should do with itself. And finally, I would add that for many people, young people, this government is basically treated as a joke. So we have such a word that this government, and especially leaders of this government, has the so-called meme creating ability, so that you can create out of them a lot of memes. And it means that if you start to make a laugh out of the government, and this government at the same time is pretending that it is controlling everything what is happening in a country, then you see like a clash of values and clash of approaches to what is in the hearts of people and what is happening on really on streets, and how the government wants to behave. So it seems that all those factors may contribute, and it seems that there will be a lot of different initiatives as a result of those protests. So maybe right now, I would say those protests are not so strong as they were, let's say, 2 weeks ago on 30th October. But I can imagine that it may result in a number of different activities. And even, you know, just yesterday I had a meeting, like an online meeting with pupils from the secondary school from Warsaw, from quite a good secondary school, kind of this, you know, elitist school. And, you know, I could feel this passion. I could feel that, you know, something important has happened in their life, and that it will bring up with some, it will result with some new initiatives and new ideas in their future life. And they will, and please note one more thing, that for them, those protests were also consequence of a total hatred raised against LGBT people. Just after presidential elections and during presidential elections, President Duda has made such a very strong slogan. He said, I quote, LGBT are not people, it is ideology. That was what President of Poland said. And then we had a lot of other hate speech statements. We have the Minister of Education, and who is an open homophobe, who is not even, you know, not having a problem with this, that he's a homophobe. So it seems to me that for them, you have different dots that connect each other with each other. Authoritarian threat, hatred towards LGBT, you know, this pressure from the European Union, which creates something like the feeling of a shame, plus women's rights. So all of this create, I think, a lot of dissatisfaction on the part of young people.
Well, I can see the parallel with the Orange Revolution that you talked about, right? The kind of, you laugh at the emperor who has clothes, or you just don't take it seriously, and it delegitimates the whole system, right? If just the delegitimization power of laughter, making fun of the people is something which we saw happen successfully in the 1980s. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church can play some role in the changes in Poland and up to 89, but the Orange Revolution and just laughter and the creativity of dissent, I think, played a big role too. So let's see what our next question is. This was sent in by email. I'd like to ask Dr. Bodnar's opinion on the current debate regarding EU funding and the rule of law in EU member states. There is a new mechanism planned that would link EU funding more tightly to the rule of law in member states. For example, observation of human rights, political independence of judiciary. How would this influence the ongoing debate on the right to abortion for Polish women, in your view? Did you get all that? I think you have to put your microphone back on.
Okay. First of all, I think that, in my opinion, the European Union does not have a competence, like a strong competence, I would say, to regulate or to put a pressure in such issues like access to abortion. Of course, it will be most probably subject of different resolutions of political character. And I know that the European Parliament is working on that kind of resolution, but it seems to me that it will not translate into any real action any legal action by the European Commission. I think Commission will rather use a situation of LGBT persons in Poland and some practices that exist in Poland as one of the methods to put some pressure on the government, because in the context of LGBT persons, LGBT people, the Commission and the European Union has a leverage in terms of one specific provision of the Treaty on Functioning of the European Union that prohibits any discrimination due to sexual orientation. With the definition of, where is the beginning of life, where you can terminate the pregnancy, and so on, European Union was always resisting to take a strong stance on this. There is a very famous case by the Court of Justice of the European Union, SPUC against Grogan, in which case the Court of Justice was kind of avoiding to take any strong decision on the very sensitive matter. But for sure, there is a growing, for sure, right now, European Union would like to combine the future EU budget with respect for the rule of law. Polish government has just today announced that they are going to veto the EU budget if this procedure is going to be adopted. And we don't know to what extent it is the negotiation point just, or whether Polish government is serious about it. My feeling is that it is rather the negotiation point. And it seems to me that at a certain point, Polish government will say that, okay, maybe we can modify something in our judiciary just in order to satisfy the Commission and not to lose access to money. Why access to money is important? Because we are really suffering due to the pandemic. And in my opinion, the government cannot afford itself to live without this money. And on the other hand, the pressure from the EU is not just the pressure by the Commission or the European Parliament, but it is the pressure coming from the major capital cities, major member states, Scandinavian member states, Netherlands, Belgium, but also Germany and France. So they know that if we have to share the money, it is not in order to support some regimes that are not fully democratic. So I think that the level of attention so I would say that in this context, that although this whole rule of law procedure is mostly about independence of judiciary, independence of constitutional court, and all those institutional aspects of rule of law, in my opinion, approach towards LGBT persons and approach towards women's rights increase like the level of hesitance, but also increase the power of politicians coming from those other member states to put a pressure on the Polish government. So although you do not have sometimes, especially with respect to women's rights, you do not have a proper legal leverage, you are pushed by your electorate to do something strong with Poland. And because of this, European Commission will not be, is not in that kind of, easy negotiation position that, it may say to Poland, okay, sorry, maybe you this time will forget you and will not, so maybe, last time you received from us money, but next time, please remember, you have to respect rule of law. I think that kind of approach will not be possible on the part of the Commission because of this pressure coming from particular member states.
We have two different kinds of courts here. We have the Constitutional Court and we have the Court of Public Opinion, right? Which also
yeah, exactly.
Here. So let me see the next question on our list. Thank you for your talk, most interesting. The point presented in favor of less restrictive abortion rights is pitched at a high level. One of the concerns is that everyday citizens, especially the non-elite urbanites, may believe their cultural norms rooted in traditional Catholicism are being overlooked. Hence, one of the reasons why the PIS maintains widespread support, period, and the recent elections reinforce this. How do you pitch the efficacy of less restrictive abortion rights to this population? So I guess the more conservative, non-elite, non-urban populations who are the traditional supporters of PIS. How do, yeah, I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah. I think there is a little bit of misconception. There might be some misconception on what is really a traditional electorate supporting law and justice and who are really people living in all those rural areas. Because please note that in the Polish public discourse, we have, and it is the kind of a Polish practice to a great extent, we have like two notions of being Catholic. So you are so-called nominal, you could be a so-called nominal Catholic, and you could be a so-called practicing Catholic. What is the difference? The difference is that if you are the nominal Catholic, it means that you name yourself, okay, I'm Catholic. Maybe from time to time you pray. Maybe from time to time you go to the Mass, to the Sunday Mass. But for sure, what you do is that you are making baptism, marriage, funeral, and you comply with all the kind of formal procedures, like all those rites of passage, as it is required by the Catholic religion. So your child would take First Communion, and basically you will pretend that everything is fine and that you are traditional Catholic. But in general, you will not be that kind of hard believer, and that is the majority of Polish Catholics. Okay. Because everybody may name just any friend or acquaintance who would not regularly go to Mass, but he or she would go to the Mass just on, let's say, Christmas, okay, or just on Easter. But in a daily life, you don't need this, you don't practice. But at the same time, you are not making any formal exit from the church. You are not making apostasy act because still you feel that it is a part of a tradition, to be affiliated with the church. But there is a second group, which are those believers that are attending all the masses, that are praying, and that are like practicing on a daily basis. And their number is more or less 35–40% of the Polish population. So you have the huge disparity between those people who are really hard believers or so-called practicing Catholics and those who are just nominal ones. And moreover, it seems that there is a certain relaxation in moral norms when it comes to such decisions of your life, when it comes concerning, for example, pregnancy or termination of a pregnancy, or use of contraceptives, or access to IVF. So for example, I think access to IVF is interesting, that because the Catholic Church has a very strong, quite strong position on this, that it should be you shouldn't manipulate with embryos, you shouldn't basically abuse those procedures. But it is completely not understandable by the majority of Polish people, including hard believers. Come on, the result is a child. So why are you prohibiting us from having a child? Why are you just referring to some issues that it is some manipulation with the God's will? If there is a God's will that we are going to have a baby, that's great. We will have a baby. We will have more love in our family. I would say that when it comes to abortion, it seems that when you have a real problem, life decision, it might be like this, that even for people who are believers, they may try to escape with this decision. They may try to seek for some solution. But the problem is that if they live in an area which is heavily traditional, it is extremely difficult to find a medical doctor or the medical hospital that performs the abortion. So the good example is Podkarpacie, which is the southern region of Poland, where there is no single abortion, legal abortion made over the last couple of years. Not at all. So even if you have all those three conditions, the only chance for you is either underground or just going abroad to Slovakia, because Slovakia is the closest country from there. So I would like to refer to the statistics I gave, that 67%, 68% of the Polish people claim that access to legal abortion as it is provided in the so-called compromise is okay, and it should be continued. So 67 is much more. So it goes into this group of also those traditional believers, traditional Catholics.
I think you also mentioned that many of the demonstrations you were discussing were in smaller towns and in rural regions, right? Which is a surprise. Yeah. This isn't just a Warsaw phenomenon, right? This isn't just...
No. More than 200 cities, we had demonstrations.
Yeah. So let me see. I think we have time for maybe one more question here. We have about 8 minutes left. So this question might take 8 minutes to read. Let me see here. It's a pretty long one. Based on publicly available data in 2017, there were 94,030 abortions in Canada. It is estimated that this number represents approximately 90% of all abortions performed in Canada involving Canadian residents. You mentioned the number of Poland being approximately 1,000. That's a large contrast that would likely speak to the effectiveness, in quotation marks, of the anti-abortion law. But perhaps a part of the issue is also the fact that in Poland, in contrast to Canada, the majority of women polled are actually against abortion if asked how they feel about it personally, though they likely support a pro-choice approach and allow each woman to decide according to her own conscience. I'm interested in your opinion about the liberalization of the abortion law in Poland. Do you feel that it would really increase the numbers of annual abortions so dramatically, given that personally so many Polish women are against abortion? And I think that relates to some of the things you were just saying before about Catholicism and identity about the Catholicism.
A very interesting question. Certainly, we have this discussion right now about, what does it mean, what is our moral choice, and what is our choice that should be available under law or not, and what is the role of the state to regulate this. And it seems to me that although number of women, as Sylvia has written, could be personally against, then it does not mean that in a situation of a real problem, she wouldn't like to have a choice. And second, they claim that it is not the state to dictate. It is our own conscience, our beliefs, our morality that should be a determining factor here, and not the state that should replace us with this decision, and that should push us into a situation we wouldn't like to be, because it might create this situation of degrading or even inhuman treatment. So we have similar discussion. I would like to come back to, by answering this question, I would like to come back to this jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. So the European Court of Human Rights basically indicated this. Okay, you have under your law access to legal abortion, but it is not effective. It is to great extent illusory because we have a number of cases, we have statistics, we have some data coming from non-governmental organizations indicating that the real demand or real number of women that would like to make abortion and are in those conditions under the law should be simply higher because of the population of Poland. And interestingly, despite those judgments, nothing has changed. Maybe it has changed. I think when the case of Alicja Tysiąc was decided, it was more or less 400. Right now it's 1,000. But this change is not really significant, taking into account the population of Poland. But it seems to me that this protest is not just about this. It is about going into the liberalization by allowing abortion at choice. So it is one of the major claims of this women's strike that abortion should be allowed, not because of meeting any conditions, but just at any time, as long as the pregnancy is not older than 12 weeks. So the question is, okay, let's imagine that we have a change of power. Let's imagine that we have this, political turning point. To what extent the new majority will be able to regulate on this? Will be able to change this thinking from the thinking on more or less pro-life approach to the thinking on pro-choice approach. So the big question, it's obvious that the left-wing party, Alliance of Democratic Left, will be in favor of this. But what about the major central party, which is the Civic Platform? What is their position on this? Nobody really knows. Most probably they would like to keep the compromise, but maybe they will be, because of the pressure by the women's strike and women's movement, they will be pushed into making some more significant step. And in this context, I think that my role here as the Ombudsman still, but also as a person who is commenting what is happening in Poland, should not be to say what is my personal opinion. Because I think that in this particular situation, I should not use the capacity of my office in order to claim that I'm in favor of this or the other option. During my whole term, I was trying to present a position that we should simply create a law which is effective, and we should also stick to the human rights standards. After adoption of this judgment, I don't have a doubt that this judgment is contrary to human rights standards. There is a very important case, Mellet against Ireland, decided by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, which says that it is an obligation for the woman to deliver a child with the genetic disease, with the level genetic disease, is contrary to human rights standards, is contrary to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But what I try to promote in the public debate is that maybe we need Irish solution. By Irish solution, I mean not the finality of the Irish solution, so what has been adopted as a result of the referendum, but what happened before. So in a number of my statements, I referred to the idea of so-called Citizens' Assembly created in Ireland. Citizens' Assembly was a group of 100 citizens of Ireland that have been selected by the research institution in order to represent the whole spectrum of Irish society. The role of this assembly was to discuss issue of access to abortion, to invite to this discussion scholars, bioethical scholars, medical doctors, lawyers, and via the but also victims, but also people, NGOs, people who wanted to take a position on this issue. The Citizens Assembly was consulting this issue of access to abortion for a couple of months. There was a secretariat that collected all the discussions. All those discussions were subject of media transmission, so everybody could see it. And interestingly, the operation of this panel's assembly has changed Irish mentality, because people started to understand that it is a very complex issue, that it shouldn't be just decided on the basis of one or the other political decision, that it needs a bigger reflection in the society. And scholars claim that it was a huge success of kind of bringing democracy back to citizens. Because please note, if you give this possibility of acting only to political parties, they tend to be constrained by their political visions and political affiliations. They are not representing whole spectrum of ideas. If you give the floor to citizens and the whole spectrum of citizens, where everybody may speak with his or her own capacity and may enjoy the expertise of scholars, then suddenly it may appear that this spectrum of voices is much bigger. So maybe that is the point for Poland. Maybe that is something for Poland, that maybe there will be a political change. That kind of citizens' assembly should be established to discuss this topic seriously, with deep attention, and later on the basis of reflections of this panel, to adopt a law that would find public legitimacy and public support. Of course, you will always have people on the one side and on the other side, but it seems to me there is some room for we should name it compromise, for some solution that would be adequate to societal needs.
Well, on this, I think, optimistic and concrete suggestion, I think we should probably wrap this up for now, but I'm sure I speak for everybody who's been at this talk today when we thank you for your presentation and for the answering questions, your patient answering of more than half an hour of questions. I hope that you'll stay in touch, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk again as this develops, that you don't forget us over here in Edmonton. Maybe once the Oilers season starts, we'll be back in touch again. I know you have your Oilers cap. So thank you again for participating. And maybe I'll use this last minute or second here to remind everybody that Wirth Institute has its event next week, where we're sponsoring Jewish Studies Week. And those of you who are here might be interested to know that on Monday, you have the opportunity all day long to watch the Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust lecture, where Wolf Gruner of the University of Southern California will be talking about Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. That Q&A will be at 6 o'clock Monday afternoon. The information is on our website. So I hope to see you then. And Dr. Bodnar, again, thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope to see you again soon too. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Joseph. Bye. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Rochelle, for organizing this great event. It was a real pleasure. And, I would love to come back one day to Edmonton, not only for Oilers, but basically for the participation in the work of your institute. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
We'll stay in touch. We'll hold you to that.
Exactly. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.